for the day. So the format will be similar to what it was yesterday. Go for about an hour and a half. We'll take a look, and then we'll break again for lunch after about 3 hours or so. Good breaking point. Cover what we did yesterday, and I'll use the REST meet and use case and wasn't able to get it working. I should mention that the hands-on and all the exercises that we're doing are in the hands-on guide of the training material. So if you go through the various different hands-on exercises, they are in the hands-on guide that you can download from the support site. Okay, just to summarize where we left off yesterday, when we're policy manager console, go to here. We serve our account manager service, which was our SOAP service, and our service, which was our REST service. So we created those physical services and virtualized those on to the network director instance. When you virtualize them, remember there's the option that you can create services as processes. You select you can these to act as a proxy, in which case then you can update your physical service, and by updating the physical service, it will propagate those changes to proxied virtual service. Okay, whether you do that for either a service or for the REST service. Then what one of the things that I wanted to show was the ability to do the mediation. What's mediation from a REST service, going from content, the actual message content where the endpoint service was sending XML, and we converted it to JSON when the request was being sent back to the client SOAP service, in which case it was our account manager service, and we wanted to send back, instead of SOAP response back, we're going to send JSON content back. So that we bind our SOAP service. A new binding, and we added it to our virtual service. So here you can see we have our original SOAP, and we created the HTTP binding for our SOAP service. Then what I got to do yesterday and why I couldn't get the request to work was when you go here to the access points, you have to add an access point for your binding type. So I would go to the SOAP service and with the browser invoke the list account service or operation, but I couldn't do that because I didn't have the binding. Now, if I do my HTTP binding here, I can actually invoke the backend SOAP service using a browser. Okay, so here's where I actually invoke the service, use the context path to the actual verse that is hosted on the network director, and then I add, if we look at stole, because don't forget, even for REST services, we're generating a WSDL. Here, and I look at the HTTP binding for my service. In order to list accounts operation, you can see that I have to append the special list accounts in order to invoke this particular operation. So when we invoke this operation, then I should get the response back as JSON. So really, when we were actually sending to the list accounts operation in SOAP UI, we get the response back as a SOAP. So now I do it through the browser. You can see I can send the same request, get the response back. Okay, so the actual response coming back. So we're able to show that not only are we doing mediation between the message content, but actually mediating between SOAP and REST as well. So in the network director, you do all this type of mediation, and through the policy manager and the ability to be able to add means, you're able to provide type of mediation. Okay, questions on this part? Okay, this is where we left off yesterday. So point 10 is that in order to request to any service that is being managed by the policy manager, you have to have a contract, right? So we created our anonymous contract, and with this contract, we will to invoke the services that we had managed. We'll talk about not only what contracts do, but the different types of contracts that are supported by the policy manager. Start off this morning talking about how we can apply various different policies to our service. Okay, so to the slide now, I'll do a few slides, and then we'll actually start applying policies to our account manager virtual service. Okay, what we'll discuss then are operational policies that you can apply to the services that you're managing. And operational policies are the ones that apply to the time. Okay, operational policies can be used to secure, manage, and monitor your services at runtime. Two other types of policies that you'll see under the operational folder, or sorry, under the policies folder, compliance policies that and those are when you actually create services. Those are to ensure that the services adhere to a specific set of rules or lines that you have within your organization. Have quality of service policies ensure that a specified quality of service is met based on contractual obligations or defined requirements. So OS policies could be service level agreement policies where a certain is required for a specific service or a specific set of partners. But with the operational policies now. So policies, again, are applied at runtime. And these policies that you apply can be applied to an organization in case all the services underneath that organization will inherit that policy. Or they to a service and to the service operation level if that's required. Multiple operational policies to an organization, service, or operation. Okay, so you could have multiple authentication types for a single service. You can also apply the operational policies to the next hop web service. You allow then the network director to implement the policy required for the next hop. So, for example, if a network requires basic authentication, when the request from the network director to the physical service, you could apply an operational policy to the physical service, even though that physical service is not being managed by the policy manager. But the director will be able to read that policy information that is set next hop service and send the request with the authentication in the actual message itself. Then operational policy templates, and copy and move these templates to an organization, or you can apply those to any number of services, and by making a change to that template, we will change the template that is applied to all the services. So look at the different types of operational policies that are with the product. There are 3 different policy types. And the first one is policy, operational policy definition. So a single policy definition is just one of the policy with just a single definition included in that policy. So an example of that would be our basic auditing policy. It has no other policies that are included as part of it. Is just a single policy definition, as opposed to an aggregate policy. So aggregate policy is a collection of operational policies. So you can actually aggregate operational policies together to create an aggregate policy and apply this policy to a single service. So you're using a set of policies over and over again, and you want to aggregate them together so you don't have to remember to attach policy 1, policy 2, policy 3. Then create an aggregate policy that includes policy 1, policy 2, and policy 3, and use that to attach to your service or services. Okay, and we have what are line policies. Line policies are our legacy Service Manager 5.2 policies, and those use what are called policy components. Now, there are line policy components that currently are not supported using our Policy Manager 6.x policy framework. So you will need to continue to use a pipeline policy to implement the functionality that is required. So we have the equivalent policy in 6.x. We'll continue to support the use of our pipeline policy. Actually, for custom rating from 5.x, we have continued to support the pipeline policies until they're able to migrate to 6.x policies. Okay, so we have different types of operational policies. So if we look then at the type of policies that are with the product, and these here are our 6.x policies, then you can use any of these to create your policy templates or standalone policies. So if we look back at these policy types, policies that you're seeing in the next slide can be used to create a single policy or an aggregate policy. If you look here, that we ship with 6.x are AWS policies. So security policies as well as auditing policies that allow you to audit your services, as well as authentication and authorization policies, your policies that allow you to create a policy that includes combinations of these policies, and an XML policy, which is used to create a custom policy if that's required. Okay, so we'll have some of these policies now to our services. Now, say that these WS security policies are very complex, and product really adheres to the WS security specification, to the WS policy specification, so that we can ensure interoperability with other messaging or web implementations. So, these policies, unless WS security specification very well, it's really recommended to use the templates that are there, modify those based on your requirements. If you change some of the flags, right, and change some of the flags, it could cause all of a sudden, it could cause the policy to actually break unless you know what you are as the actual WS security specification. So it's recommended that you use our templates that we provide and make the modifications and tweaks based on your requirements. It'll be much easier if you start out using the templates rather than starting from scratch. Here are all the operational policies that are provided. And then we take these operational policies and we create some based on use cases that we found customers have used in their implementation. Okay, so these policies that are supplied, policy templates that are supplied on the box, if you look in the Policy Manager console and you go down here, up, let me my key here. You open up the main policies folder. See the operational policies that are out of the box. These are policy templates. Have folders are aggregate policies. The ones that aren't included in folders, which are the auditing policies, those are operational policies. These here then are out of the box policy templates. So you see there are various different for different types of use cases. So with the auditing policies. So if you're familiar with our usage data collection policies, are equivalent to the data as well as usage and record data. So this will collect the usage data plus the load information. Okay, then of policies that are used for different types of security, whether it's SynQuest, whether it's encrypting, or whether it's some type of username over transport, SAML over transport, Kerberos over transport, username, WS security username over transport. All these are various types of authentication can be used, security policies that can be applied to your virtual services. And you can use then these templates as basis for creating your policy that are required based on your security implementation. Okay, and we'll use some of these policies now as we go through some of the use cases. you have decided on the type of operational policy that you need to apply to your service or organization or operation, you then go the policy to the objects that are required, that require policies. So if we look at example here, you can set detailed auditing policy is attached at the organization level because we want to collect, use data, and recorded information for the services we deploy within our organization. But for this particular virtual service, we're attaching the username over transport policy, which will get a security username password be sent in the SOAP header of the request. Okay, so the username over transport policy is attached at the service level. The detailed auditing is attached at level, as is the transaction tracking policy also, organization level. Now, because the now supports WS policy, for all those WS security policies that you do attach to your service, when you view, you will see the policy definition define WSDO for the service. So here, look at the service, the use over transport policy is actually attached to this WSDO. So attach then a policy to your service. Have the you have to enforce and implement those policies, and there is a flag on the virtual service to describe whether you want to enforce or implement the policies at the virtual or for the next hop. If we want to enforce the policy, we're going to enforce the policy at the virtual service, and if we want to implement, we want to implement the operational policy that's defined at the top service. So by default, of course, we're going to enforce and implement the policy. There are some cases where you work director to enforce a policy for a particular service, so you can actually change the flag on the network director to either not enforce or not implement the policy at the next hop. Just an option that is available, whether it's for testing or for actual production. Here, when you go to your virtual service, you can actually configure the policy implement here. Okay, at a few of the operational policy use case scenarios, let our consuming application, the network director hosting a virtual service, and the physical service here the network sends to the use case that you want to implement. So you want to send WS Security username and password, and you want to actually do authentication of the end user here at the network director. Policies that you would apply to the virtual service here on the network director would be the username over transport policy, which is one of our templates. To create an authentication for authentication, that policy to the virtual service as well. Using these policies here, consumer then would send in a WS Security username password, timestamp to the virtual service, and the virtual would then implement these two policies. The username over transport would check to verify that there was a WS Security username password token in the actual request. And the end user authentication would actually authenticate the username and password that's being sent in this request to the domains that are configured as part of this authentication policy. It's these two requirements. Request is passed on to the endpoint. Okay, there's a definition at the endpoint. There's nothing that's sent, no information that's sent here to the endpoint web service. Comes back from the endpoint, that has to be done or authenticated. The response comes back, and because the username over transport policy by require you to send in a timestamp, the additional policy when it's implemented a virtual service for response, it will actually add a timestamp and send back to the consumer, the response back with a timestamp in the actual response to the consumer. Example of X5 authentication of assigned type element. In this case here, you're going to use certificate over transport, which is one of our templates, and then you would use authentication policy to authenticate the X09 certificate that's being sent in. So if you're using X509, an X509 certificate to actually do authentication, you have to make sure that that certificate is actually associated with some user within policy manager, whether it's an external user from an Active Directory user is a user that's defined within the policy manager's local domain. You have that certificate to one of those user applications within the policy manager, and that certificate needs to be stored in the policy manager's database. The consumer sends that signed or that certificate, it will to be authenticated against the partner's database to make sure that there's a user or an application associated with that certificate. So verify signature, it asks it to the endpoint, and it will send the response back. And the will have timestamp element signed and sent back to the consumer. Example of a use case where not only are you doing authentication, you also want to send some authentication credentials to the physical service. So you're applying password you're using the username over transport policy here at the virtual service and authentication. And at the physical, you're actually attaching the security policy, which allows you to configure basic authentication. So here, when the username password is in, authenticated against the policy manager's local or domain config to verify the username and password that's being sent in. And when the request is sent out to the physical service, it's actually adding in then basic authentication credentials in the HTTP header. Endpoint will then do the authentication or whatever is required with those headers to verify that the response can be back to the customer. Okay, example of signature and encryption. So again, you're using a out-of-the-box policy and adding an authentication policy. So here, an X509 certificate is sent in. The certificate is mapped to a user in the policy manager's database. Be able to indicate that certificate sent in. The consumer is sending in the sender as well as an encrypted body. So once the request gets to the network director, the network director will verify the signature and decrypt the body of the message. The request to the physical service with basic authentication credentials inserted to the HTTP header. Comes back, the network director will actually send the certificate back to the customer with a signed and encrypted message. It's back to the consumer. So those use cases, you can use the out-of-the-box policy definition in the policy manager for a lot of various different use cases. And those policies then can be tweaked a little to meet the requirements that you have as far as your specific use cases. You can custom policies under the organizational node. So you can create your own aggregate policies and those as required. So to create your operational policies again, you can create the policy or with multiple policy definitions included as part of them. The operational policies to an organization and or an operation input and or output message. Apply operational policies to any services that are managed by an embedded agent, or any virtual services that are hosted in a network director or policy manager for data power, or can apply them to the next top services that are registered in the policy manager as well if you want to have the work director implement those policies that are required for the next hop and send requests with the definition in those requests. Okay, questions on the operational policies? Okay, so there's a question on between the 5-2 policies and the edit policy. So the 5 policies are strictly the pipeline policies. So when we look here at national policies, one of the options here is to create a pipeline policy, legacy policies. So the template here, there's a pipeline policy. So I'm just going to say pipeline policy. So when we create the legacy pipeline policy, this is just using all of our legacy policy components. So here you can see that as part of this policy, you can add a bunch of to this pipeline policy. When you have your aggregate policy, these aggregate policies can't include any of the pipeline policies. These policies are really an aggregate policy that includes various different WS policy units. You don't want to mix and match using these WS policies and using a pipeline policy. Now, these situations where you do have to do that because the SO policies don't support a certain scenario, and use the pipeline policies for that. But if we support security using WS policy, it is recommended that you use the WS policy and start moving and migrating away from the pipeline policy. So unlike in the pipeline policies, where you have to actually create pipeline policy in a very specific order, right? So if I'm going to use the security component here, and I'm going to use the authorization component, I keep authorization component above the security component. I have to do authentication before I do authorization. And the pipeline policy is very sensitive to the order in which you place these components. With the WS security policy, you don't have to worry about that. The network director, by virtue of attaching these policies, will know and execute the policies in the order in which they need to be executed. So there's no, you don't have to worry about any type of ordering when you use any of these operational policies. As we go through some of our examples. Okay, what we want to do is we actually want to do some on using cases tell us to use to using some of these policies. Use case is we want to collect some usage data. But we want to collect the usage data. We want to actually collect payload information as well. So the information to do that, we have our default policy that which is the detailed auditing policy. So because we want to collect detailed auditing policy, or we will collect usage data for all services that we configure within our organization, we're going to attach the detailed auditing policy to our own organization. We're going to use the template that is here under main policies folder and attach that to our organization. In order to do that, you're going to select your organization. In the middle section, underneath the policy overview portlet, there's a policy attachment portlet. And the operational policy attachment, and there's a manage link right next to the operational policy. If you click there on that manage link, you can attach your policies to the organization. So here, I'm going to click on the attach button on the right-hand side, and you'll be able to traverse the tree here at the organization. And you'll go to the very bottom and open up that policies folder. Open up additional policies. Select the detailed auditing policy. This. And then you hit the close button at the bottom right. So now to your organization, you should see that this detailed auditing policy is attached. Detailed auditing policy actually doing. If you are in an organization, select your and open up this folder and select your account manager virtual service. And if we do the monitoring subtab for the virtual service, you'll set yes to collect some alerting information. If you go here to the next subtab, which is the logs, see that there's no data here. The data here in the logs is what we call usage data. Selected here. Any service that's managed by the policy manager, you actually see the real-time chart information, which we saw yesterday as requests were going through. Also able to collect historical charting information. Just having the service managed by the policy manager. But attach the detailed auditing policy to our organization. Let's look and see at what happens when we send a request now. So SOAP UI, and your service already configured yesterday, send a request. Actually, let me just, if you request message, say to your operation, you get the back, and let's now look at our policy manager console. So if you're on logs again, let's check the real first. So we see the request going through. Let me send request. Sometimes it could take up to a couple minutes for the policy to be implemented. Am I sending? Yeah. Can actually display here. Okay, some monitoring data here. I don't know why. It's not showing up. Okay, let me switch one. Okay, for some reason I'm not getting the monitor data. It's not showing up. So check the log file for a second to see why it's not showing up. So this is troubleshooting. I'm going to go to my network director log file. And let's see any. Oh, sorry. Do I have? Okay, so there's no error given it's not collecting the usage information. I'm not sure if it's not doing that, but it should be. Why? I don't want to hold on this. Because policy, it should take effect within seconds. Okay, so we'll find out what's going on with that, but I don't want to hold us up on finding out what the problem is, and I'll get that working. But to actually get into more sophisticated use cases.
Well,
Yes?
I attach it to my organization, and then that's not working either. But if I attach it to if I attach it at the service level, it's working. Not sure why it's not working at the org level.
Oh, okay. All right, so just attach it at the service. Keep it attached here at the org level, and just look here in Brian's, so I can show you what the data looks like. So here, what's sent through, right? When you hear to the logs subtab, you can see here. This is the usage data that's being collected. So you have your contract name that shows up. You have some basic information about the actual transaction that went through. This is what we call the usage data. Now, because we are attaching the detailed auditing policy, you're able to see the actual request payload and the response coming back. So here I can see the request. If you check this option to HTTP headers, you can actually see what's sent in by the client, and this is what is sent back from the ND to the client. Just for in regards to collecting this detailed information for troubleshooting purposes, is you're able to see what's coming inbound from the client to the ND. But what the ND is sending to the physical service, and the physical service is sending to the ND. Do that, you can at each operation. So this is at the operation level. So I can actually choose operation, go to the manage actions and click on edge routing, and you click button here in information, and then you can see that there are these auditing requirements, and you select the option to put the messages between the virtual service and the next top service. So you're not want to do this in a production environment. This is really more for troubleshooting, because remember, all the information that you're actually collecting, all that payload information is being stored in the database. So that's additional information that you're storing in the database for every single transaction that's going through. These are really troubleshooting tips that you can use to actually setting up your environment.
So,
So,
Cherryl, but that can be activated in real time just to for a little bit of time, right? To trouble.
that's right. Yes. Yes. So I'll show you. So Brian, can you send a request again? So now look here at the monitoring data. So we'll wait until Brian sends a request.
Send the
Okay. So see, if we look at real-time charts, there were a few requests sent. So now let's look at the difference in the logging. Right? Detailed auditing, and check that auditing is all the information, the recorded messages. Now you see that it's added the downstream information. So the request that's come in from the network, from the director, this is what network director is sending to the physical service. So you see the network director has stripped all this WS security information off. Right? The network director is the WS security at the network director. So the request goes to the downstream service, actually terminated, and it's not sending any of the WS security information. The downstream is sending this response back, and then again you see the headers that are being sent by downstream service if you need to, and then the network director is sending WS security header with the timestamp back to the consuming application. Case again, that you didn't have to do anything to the network director. I didn't have to stop or restart it. All the policy attachments are on real time. So there's no starting and stopping of any that's required. You can attach a policy. The policy should be implemented within 30 seconds at the most.
Cheryl.
Mm-hmm.
Cheryl, this is Paul.
Hi, Paul.
Question on this capability. When the administrator at the council on the ability to, I will call it, sniff the content of the transactions, is that fact itself logged in such a way in the audit records the same administrator cannot also then go and erase that audit record and remove any kind of evidence that they've been there watching traffic? In other words, that EVA would ever do anything like that. My security guys get real paranoid here. So is there a way that if someone at the council is doing more than just troubleshooting with that capability, is that information stored in such a way that it cannot be removed?
So I don't actually. Here you can see in the audit trails here, you can see that the policy is being attacked. But then if we delete one of these words, which you can,
and delete or a logical delete?
oh no, you can't delete the records. You can't delete the usage records. You have to actually export. when export, that is the action of exporting is recorded.
And what to export to? File,
It exports, yes, into a file.
And the database values are actually deleted as opposed to being marked as.
Yeah, you can optionally, when you export this usage data, you can optionally say you want to delete the usage data.
Okay.
And include the recorded information. So do this test export here. When you do an export like this in the auditing trail,
right.
See, it won't audit that has been exported, but as soon as the alert is finished, export is done, you will receive an alert saying the export has been completed. I think it's still going on. Let's see, I think, here. So here was a message that was generated. You will get an alert. Questions?
I missed the point. Where is that setting? Okay. The audit setting can be turned on?
Okay, so if you audit the downstream, right, it's being sent from the ND to the physical service, from the physical service back to the ND, you have to go here to the operation that you audit, right? Go here to manage routing.
Okay.
And then keep clicking through a couple screens. And you click on the option here to audit messages.
Got it. It was the mapping, that's what's the option. Okay, thank you.
Manage routing, yeah. Okay, so now attach a policy. So the first use case that we're going to set up is your authentication. We have our data set up, and we want to use security username password to authenticate a user defined within the policy manager. So there could be a user that's in an external domain, so they could be reading an Active Directory, or the user could be in the local policy manager domain, in which case you would go to the security tab here and you would create a local user. Okay, but in case we're going to use our accounts, which are actually in an LDAP domain, to authenticate the user. Okay, so now what what we'll do is we'll make a copy of of the name over transport policy. Okay, down to the policies folder in the org tree, the main folder at the very bottom. You're going to open up that operational policies folder. And at the very bottom, there's a policy called username over transport, which is send in a WS security username password to the virtual service. So click on username over transport, that folder. You'll see on the actions portlet that you have the ability to be able to copy the policy. So go ahead and make a copy of the policy. So you're going to click on the second option to copy the policy. Policy name and you're getting unique. Okay, description. This description is too long, so you have to delete it. Add things shorter. Okay, so my policy name and key, username, and I just put my initials. Okay, and apply. You have your policy create, right? And this user over transport policy you can see is made up of two separate policies, Part 1 and Part 2. You can, if you look on the actions portlet of the policy you just created, you can. The first action is to change an organization. So if you click on that change organization link, you actually that policy or move that policy to your organization. So just go ahead and either put it in your engineering organization or at your top level org. Okay, policy should now be moved into your organization. So we can just look at the aggregate policy. So if Part 1, you can see that this is a binding policy, a security transport binding policy. So this is really saying how you're going to attach and the over transport. So this is very, very security specific and per the specification. Part 2, it's just the token that you're going to send as over that transport binding that you're using. So see that we did select username. Okay, now we're going to take that policy and attach it to our virtual service. So to your account manager virtual service. By seeing your virtual service in the tree in your engineering organization, detail subtab, you're going to select in the policy attachments portlet. You're going to select the manage option for the operational policy. That link. And for organization now, you're going to open up the folder where the policy folder where you just moved that username over transport policy. And go ahead on when you look at your virtual service, you see that you should have policies attached, your detailed auditing policy and your username over transport policy. So go into SOAP UI. So go to SOAP UI client. And send a request to your virtual request to go ahead and request to your list to the list operation. Okay, now they're getting an error saying that you're missing a WS security header. Because now we have that policy attached to our virtual service, it's requiring that we send in a security username password header. Okay, so go down into your SOAP UI, into the properties section. That you can enter a username and password. It's going to put some bogus name here. So just enter some bogus name in the password field. Enter any password that you want. Just enter any username. And what to do is where it says WS password type in the properties, you're going to want to select text. And send the request. Okay, response back. Look here at the request at the data in SOAP, you will see that it did send out a WS security header now with the password included in it. But note now that the use password that I used was just some random username and password. There was no authentication being done at all on that username or password. Attaching this username over transport policy to the virtual service only says to the network director to check to see if the request message has the username password header included as part of the request message. It is not saying authenticate and make sure that that user exists in the policy manager domains. If you want to now authenticate the name and password that you're sending in, you have a specific authentication policy to that. We're going to now create an authentication policy. Authentication policy is not something that is shipped out of the box. We're going to need to create our own authentication policy. So open up your organization and with your user over transport policy, the policies folder and your operational policies folder. We're going to add our authentication policy. So in the operational policies folder, you'll see on the right-hand side of the screen, there's an add policy option. Okay, so you're on the add policy, bottom right in the blue ribbon, and of policy that we're going to select is an authentication policy. So select, pull down, select authentication policy. The button, going to click on the next button and the name. And go ahead and finish. You don't have to give it a key, it will get automatically generated. To our authentication policy, but we need to configure it. So the authentication policy portlet in the middle portion of the screen, modify link there. So go ahead and click on the modify link underneath the authentication policy portlet. So when you bring, you'll see that there's a subject category. You can select consumer, end user, or user find. It will become important when we talk more about contracts, but for now we're doing end user authentication, authenticating a consumer application. So we're going to select the second button, which is end user. Select end user. Domains on the left-hand side there. Go ahead and select both those domains over using the arrow in the middle to the right-hand side. And then, so these are the domains that you want to use to authenticate users from. And apply. Okay, so my authentication policy and username over transport policy. Now go into your engineering organization, open services folder, select your account manager virtual service. Go attach that authentication policy that you just created to the virtual service. Okay, you're going to go again to the policies attachment port and operational policies. You're going to click on the manage link, and you're going to now select your created authentication policy. So in the tree, open up your operational policies folder and select the new authentication policy that you created. And when you click on the apply button at the bottom right, and your virtual service is now updated with the authentication policy. So you should have 3 policies attached to that service. The detailed auditing policy, your username over transport, which is looking for a WS security username, password, and the authentication policy, which is now going to authenticate and verify that the username that you're sending in this policy for this over transport policy actually resides in either the local or the external training domain. Okay, so back to SOAP UI. And send a request. Continue, go ahead and send the request using the bogus user. You can see that you should get an error because the request onto the ND that has verified that this is a username password token initial request, but now hitting the authentication policy and sending in is not user in either the local domain or the training domain. Okay, it's SOAP UI and into the properties section on the bottom of the screen. And instead of in the username field, go ahead and enter your admin user ID. And the password. And the request again. You should get a valid response back. Okay, and so now the request gone through. The org director has checked to verify that there's a username password in the request and has executed the authentication policy to verify that the username and password that's being sent in the request is actually in either the local or the external domain. So my logging's working. So if you go to the logs tab, monitoring, subservice, and go logs, you should see the being processed. Look at the usage detail. If you double click on that request, if you look at the usage data, you can see, if you go about halfway down, you can see end user identity. Show the end user identity details for the user that was actually authenticated. So in this, authenticated from the training domain, which was my external domain, the account. On that. So why don't we take a little break right now for 10 minutes. We'll come at 10 to the hour and continue with the next use case, which will be to authorize the users. Okay, and come back in 10 minutes. Now running. If you're back, can you just let me know to make sure that everyone's back? Break. continue now with our use case. So we have on working now, and we're using username over transport to authenticate the user. So now the next thing is, what if we want to do authorization? So in authorization, there are 2 steps that are required. The first is you need to create an auditing rule at the organization level, and then you need to create an authorization policy. So we will first create an authorization rule. So in order to create the authorization rule, you have to do that at the organization level. Click on your engineering organization. There's a sub-tab under tabs. The second to the last one is an authorization sub-tab. Here's where you can create your end user authorization rules. So these rules actually are authorizing end users to be able to invoke services. Okay. With clicking the authorization link, you'll see on the right-hand side the Add Rule button. So you're going to click on that Add Rule button and rule name. Okay, and when you're click on Next, you're going to select the services that you want to be part of this authorization rule. Whenever you see any dialogue like this where you have a top-level organization that's checked, and then you have beneath that organization, but what this does is it's all the objects for that particular organization. So in this case, it's selecting all the services that are part of the organization. If you add a new service to the organization, that'll automatically be included as part of the rule. To start limiting the scope, so you uncheck the organization now and you just select specific services, then it means that that particular rule, in this case, this particular authorization rule, only applies to checked services that are checked on this organization. So in this case, we'll check the engineering organization, and we'll just select our account management service. This also applies to the operations underneath that. So limit the scope to just specific operations for service if you wanted to do so. Are you selected your virtual service? Go ahead and click on Next. And you select the users or groups that are authorized to access your service. Here, you can actually admin user, so you can in the name field, enter your admin user, and when it says within, you can see that the domain and the training domain are available. The training domain will be there by default, which is our LDAP server domain. Type can be exact, or you can use and you could for all admin users if you wanted to. Then you click on search button, and it should bring up your admin user, and click on that admin user and use arrows in the middle to move that user to the right-hand side. So this now is authorizing any of the users that are configured on the right-hand side to access our service. Okay, and click on Finish. Okay, and now you have your authorization rule created. But you cannot use this authorization rule with an authorization policy. You need to create another policy, authorization policy, and then attach that to our virtual service. So your operational policies, where you have your username over transport policy and your authentication policy defined. Policies folder, right-hand side of the screen, you'll see the Add Policy button. So you're in the Add Policy button, and we're going to authorization policy. So in the Add Policy pull-down, you're going to select Authorization Policy. You can click on Next. Policy name. Go ahead and click on Finish. Oh, sorry. Close. Okay, so the create, and we need to configure the policy. So in the authorization policy portlet, we're going to click that modify link right underneath it, under tab. The only thing we need to change is subject category being end user. So like for the authentication policy, we had to say authenticating an end user versus a consumer, which we're going to use for contracts. With the authentication policy, we have to make sure that that subject category is the same as our authentication policy. So we're going to select end user to authorize. Any domain, the authorization rules that we're using are actually coming from the local policy manager. They're not, the authorization rules don't reside in an external system like SiteBinder. Okay, finish here and close. All right, last step, like we with our authorization authentication policy, is we need to attach this authorization policy to our virtual service. So you can open your engineering organization, open this folder, select your manager virtual service, policy attachments portlet, click on manage option for the operational policy, and select traverse down the tree, open operational policies folder, and select the authorization policy that you just created. Click on apply. You should have 4 policies attached. User report, the authentication policy, the authorization policy, and the detailed auditing, which we have attached at the organization level. You can see here there's no order that we had to specify. We can't move them up or down. The network director will know how to execute the policies that you have attached. Now, we're going to go back to the SOAP UI. And your request that we sent last time with the username with your username defined in SOAP UI in the properties of SOAP UI at the bottom left. Yes, again. Okay, and set up your authorization rule with that same user, that admin user, that should go through. Now, and change that username, change to one of the other admin users. So I'll just admin 3 instead of 30. And request again. You would expect that request to fail as it did. So what happened? Received the request. It actually verified that there was a WS security header and password header in the request. So able to pass policy that transport policy. Right? Looked at that username over transport token, and it tried to authenticate the username that was in that token. So in case admin 3 was authenticated, because that is a valid user in our training domain, and got to the authorization policy, and based on the rules that I have configured in my organization, that was not configured part of the authorization rules, so it held the authorization. To the monitoring subtab of my virtual service, you should really be able to see the authorization in the log tab. Okay, then on use case, how to touch policies or creating policies.
Back with the authorization policy, I got late to the
Okay. So authorization policy, you just create by selecting the subject category of user, right, which is because we do end user authentication and authorization, and you select the local domain because it's where we're doing the authorization within the policy manager. Okay, you have to make sure that you have at the organization level your organization rule created, and that rule has to include that you want to authorize the user against, and the identities or user groups that have access to the particular okay. All of these that I'm doing here as part of the training are in the hands-on training guide, and they're step-by-step guide to actually set up these use cases. So I'm going to go back to the slides, and I'm talking about the contract. So remember, in order for us to even send the request through our service, we had to create what was called an anonymous contract that basically said, allow any consumer to be able to invoke my service. So there's another type of contract that actually can be configured. I'm going to look at the two different types of contracts and what this is and the advantages of using one versus the other. Okay, here to the slides, and then I'll actually set up a use case using a different type of contract. Okay, fine. Contract. As for you have a contract defined in order to invoke any service that is managed by the policy manager, a contract is required. If there's no contract set up, you cannot actually invoke the service. So service provider, you can offer contracts to your consumers. As a consumer, you can actually request a service provider. When you create a contract, it's actually driven by the workflow. So by default, we set up a default contract workflow, and that will control the state of the contract, whether it's in draft state or it has been activated. And at which time it's activated, you can start sending requests to the service that is included as part of the contract. With a default contract workflow, and that workflow can be modified as required by any organization. Define a contract. The contract is comprised of three different pieces. First, find the services that are available to the consuming organization. Services do you want to allow consumers to be able to invoke? You define identities from a consuming organization that are authorized to access the services that you're offering. And the third is you can optionally attach QoS or SLA policies to a contract. So a contract between a consumer and a provider, you require a certain level of response time for that contract defined between a particular and a particular service provider. There are two types of contracts that you can define: or named or authorization contract. Okay, at the difference between two contracts. Usually we set up anonymous and anonymous contract. Anonymous contract allows any consumer the ability to access the services that are being offered by the provider as part of the contract. In the provider organization, you have two services defined, and define an anonymous contract for service one. Any consumer or can actually access your service. In an authorization contract, this is a little different. In a contract, you're actually specifying consumer application identities that are allowed to services that you are providing. In this case, you can see in the provider organization services, and in the community clouds, there are various different application IDs. Now, the contract itself, use the service and application IDs that allow to invoke that service. So it's named or authorization contract that is created at one, and application two are to invoke service one be provided. Other applications are to any of the services that are defined within the provider. They would not through because they're defined as part of the contract. Use cases for using name authorization contracts. In this case, we have an application calling a web service. So there's an end user. User logs into, say, a portal application and username and password to access the portal application. There is then Authentication repository, and once they're on the portal, from the portal, say they want to access some information. So that travel information from the portal application, the portal application is actually making a call, a web service call, director to be able to pull up some travel information. When then is actually sending its request through the network director, as request it's sending in its application ID and password. So to the network director is actually verifying that application ID and password that are being sent in our first application IDs and there is a contract defined for a particular application ID and the service that that application ID is trying to invoke. So in this case, the whole service. If contract then that is set up for the application ID and then the rest will be allowed to go through and the user will be able to get the full information response back. Okay, one use case for using a named or authorization contract. Cases if you have business partners. So you have several partners and you have your services defined within your organization. And you're allowing business partners to access very different services. But those businesses all have a different SLA policy that need to be applied. So say for business partner 1, you're allowing them to send 100 requests per month. And for business partner 2, the response time has to be less than 100 milliseconds. In this case, you would create different contracts for each of those different business partners. So with contract, it would find the business partner's ID and services that the business partner would be allowed to invoke. You would attach their SLA policy to that contract that is being created for them. So if the difference between a named contract and an contract, so named authorization contract or an anonymous contract, there's differences between the two and configuration that's required on the contract that you're using. So using an anonymous or an authorization or contract, you can apply either types of contracts to services or a managed service. So in this case, you could apply it to a physical service that it would be managed by a binded agent. That you create do not apply to the unmanaged service. So a physical service that's managed by a binded agent or virtualized on an SOA container will have a contract applied to it. In a named authorization contract, you need to define consumer identities. So identities are application IDs or consumer IDs that you define within the policy manager and include as part of a contract to say that these consumers are allowed to be able to have to a certain I'm offering. If in a named authorization contract, then you have to have authentication policy defined. So somehow you have to authenticate those consuming identities that are being sent in the payload, in the actual request message that is coming in. So you need to create an authentication policy and attach that to your virtual service by those consuming identities for an authorization contract. For a contract, you don't even need any type of authentication. You actually send in a request with no policies attached. You just have that contract. If an authorization or contract, you do not need an authorization policy. Okay, you don't have to define authorization rules. You don't have to define an authorization policy. By default, an authorization or named contract implies that you're doing authorization, and you don't need to set up any authorization rules. Whether it's or a named or authorization contract, you can attach quality of service policies to the contract. It doesn't matter what type it is. So create a contract. What options and from contracts folder. So as a provider, you can offer a contract. As a consumer, you can request a contract. And when you select request, you'll get a similar type of dialogue that's showing up. So what to do is you have to give the contract a name when you create it, and then give it an effective date to start the contract, expiration date, so when the contract actually expires, you can never expire the contract. This control piece, this is where the contract is actually anonymous or it is a named or authorization contract. So if you select the top button, which is the default, you're creating an named contract. Select the bottom. This creates an anonymous contract that allows any consumer to send in a request to the service included as part of the contract. You're creating an anonymous or a named or authorization contract. You also need to select a provider organization. So which organization is actually providing the service that's part of the contract. And if you named or authorization contract, you're going to select a consuming organization. And this consuming organization is where you actually define the consumer identities that are allowed to invoke the service you have defined as part of the contract. Create the contract. By default, this contract is put into a draft state. And in order to activate the contract so that you can actually invoke service, you have to go to the workflow portlet and activate that contract. Once it's activated, then you actually invoke revoke the service. Contract itself, you define the scope of the contract and authorization rules. If you have the organization selected, then any service that's added after actually activated will automatically be included in the contract. You can unselect the organization and you can select the and/or operations that you want to include as part of the contract. Contract, you also need to define consumer application identities that are part of the contract. So when you define a named contract, you're actually selecting a consumer organization. In that consumer organization, you're assuming there are identities that are defined within the organization. So to the consumer organization, you within this organization identity either see some users or application IDs that are included as part of this organization. So to define which of these identities are actually allowed to invoke the service they're defining as part of that authorization. The create here can either be from the local policy manager's database or exist in an external LDAP domain. Or external domain. So create your contract, you select the services as well as identities that you want to include of that contract. And if you want to include as part of the contract a QoS policy, you can add as well. Okay, remember 3 things that make up the scope of a contract: the service identities as well as the QoS policies. So when you get a named contract, as I said before, you have to have some way of authenticating those consuming identities. So you must attach some type of authentication policy to that service. You have to define how to authenticate the user and what type of credentials are you expecting, and need the authentication policy to actually tell the network director to authenticate those credentials that are being sent in from one of the domains that you have defined within your organization. Now, create this authentication policy. Now, instead of the subject category being end user like we had it set previously, the subcategory actually now has to be set to consumer. Oh, sorry. No? Oh,
Yeah.
oh, I was, or it wasn't cut off the whole time.
Before you switch slides, it's off and then we couldn't hear anything.
Oh, okay. Okay, so here, let's go through this step. So the consumer sends in the credentials, right? The ND will check to see if there's a contract in place for the service that's being invoked. And if the contract is an authorization contract, then it has to verify these credentials that are being sent in against the identities that are included as part of that contract. Once the identities are included as part of the contract, the request is actually sent to the endpoint web service. Okay, then summarizes the difference between a named or authorization contract versus using end user authorization. So we set up end user authorization before we took our break, where we authenticated and authorized an end user. When we actually created an end user authorization use case, we had to create an operational policy that includes the method of authenticating the end user. So in this case, we used username over transport, our username over transport policy. Then we created an authentication policy, created the end user, and created an authorization policy was used in conjunction with the authorization rules to authorize specific users to invoke service defined within our authorization rules. Okay, the contract that we used to set up our end user authorization was an anonymous contract. We didn't care who was to our service, but we talked about was the service that was defined within that contract. If we're going to set up a named or authorization contract, which is what we're going to do now as part of the next use case, is we're an operational policy that includes of authenticating the consumer identity. Okay, that policy could still be username over it. Could still be a username password token. We need an authentication policy when selected that we want to use to verify identity that's being sent in. And we change the subject category of that policy to consumer, from end user to consumer. And to define a contract that includes the consuming identities and the services that those consuming identities are allowed to invoke. So you see, if you're using a named contract or an authorization contract, there's no need to create authorization rules, and there's no need to create an authorization policy, because by the verb of using that named contract, you're implying then doing authorization, and so up any additional rules. Okay, to summarize then, for any managed by the policy manager, you must have a contract in place. It could either be an anonymous contract or a named or authorization contract. A contract allows any consumer to be able to that's defined as part of that contract. It doesn't any type of authentication or authorization. A contract, on the end, requires authentication, requires a consuming IDs and service that those consuming identities are allowed to actually invoke. So, contract, you will need to set up authentication. You do not need a type of authorization rules or an authorization policy. Behind the contract scope, you mean the services included as part of the contract, the identities that are allowed to invoke those services, and optionally you can attach quality of service policies to the contract if that becomes necessary. The policy ships with a default contract workflow. So when a contract is initially created, it is set up in a draft mode. And the contract to actually be used, you have to activate the contract from the workflow port for the contract. Okay. Then on use a named contract versus a contract. And really that's going to be based on your requirements. If to be able to collect usage data and separate the usage data by contracts so they know which consumers are actually consumers, then you can name contract, and then the contracts will be collected as part of the usage data, the contract names. More, you need to attach quality of service policies for then to use a named contract. And if you have business partners, partners that are consuming some of your services, in most cases people will use named contracts for business partner interaction. They can create separate contracts for those business partners, and those business partners will have specific entities, and they will have, in general, have their own organization defined within the policy manager organizational hierarchy. And you can keep those contracts separate by business partners, and each of those business partners may have a different method of authenticating identities, but now have contracts for business partners. If you really don't care about collect information per they can use an anonymous contract, and you could set up end user for or your groups and use just a global contract for all your services. So it's really going to be up to how you want to collect the usage data for each of those orders that you're your services. I would say of our customers do use named contracts. Okay, so now we set up a named contract. So contract is going to be defined between our QA organization and our engineering organization. The engineering organization is a service provider. The organization is an organization. So in this organization, we're going to have to create identities, where those could be our business part IDs, application IDs, but those IDs will need to reside in the QA organization. Create then a named contract between the engineering organization and the QA organization. The organization consumer IDs, we include and allow to invoke the account manager virtual service. We'll use the US security username password to authenticate those consuming identities. A little different now than what we had previously. Okay, let's go into Manager Console. The thing we have to do is we have to deactivate anonymous contract because we don't want to use that contract anymore. So go into your engineering organization under contracts. The contracts that you have created, or contract that you have created for your account manager service, you want to deactivate that contract. This is actually deactivated. Send a request to it that request should fail, right? Authorization failure. So we'll go here to the monitoring data of my an authorization failure, even if I'm sending in admin ID. Alerts subtab, I should see that I get authorization error that the user is not authorized to invoke the operation. The reason being is because now I don't have a contract. I have no contract in place. You can actually send a request. Okay, so now we're going to create our named contract. So our contract is created between the QA organization and the engineering organization. So we're on the contracts folder. You click on Offer a Contract. Click on the Offer Contract button on the right-hand side. This contract see in the files, you can set it up to never expire, or you can set the expiration time if you want. The access control here. So for an anonymous contract, we selected the second button. We're going to keep opt selected. We're going to enforce the contract by authorizing an application or consumer organization. Okay, next. We have to select our provider organization. So the organization is where our services reside and is a service provider. So you keep the engineering organization selected. Select the consumer organization. So you're going to check the box left-hand side. And you need to select the consumer organization. So the consumer organization should be QA organization in your top-level organization. So select Open a top-level organization. Underneath that, you should see QA. You select the QA organization and close. You should now have your authorization contract defined, and you should see that contract is in a draft state. So the Details tab of the contract, you see the top portlet in the middle is a contract overview. The contract scope shows that the engineering organization is selected, and you can open up the services folder. It includes all the services in your organization as part of that contract. So in order to limit the scope, you click on that Manage Contract Scope button at the bottom of the contract scope portlet, and you select the services and or operations that you wanted to be included as part of the contract. Down the middle a little more, you can see here now there's the Consumer Identities portlet. This QA organization checked, and if you open that Identities folder, you'll see there are no identities in there. If the QA organization is checked, I can still activate this contract. If I add identities to my QA organization, they will automatically be included as part of the contract. So let's go ahead and activate our contract. We have the scope being the engineering organization and the consumer or QA organization. Okay, so workflow portlet on the right-hand side, the contract workflow portlet, you'll see that there's an action to activate the contract. You're going to click on that link, activate contract, and go ahead and perform the action to activate the contract. See that the contract is actually activated. Those buttons in the middle are now grayed out, so you make any changes to this contract. If you need to make any changes to the contract, in the portlet on the right-hand side, you'll see that you can actually start a new version of the contract, in which case you can click and it will start a new version of the contract. The button will turn blue so that you can now make modifications. And you'll need to activate your contract again after you make those changes. Contract is now in place. So the second thing I need to do is I need to go to my QA organization and I need to create or entities to that organization that are to be allowed to invoke. Okay, click on your QA organization and select the Details subtab. You'll see that the third portlet down is the organization identities. So when you add identities, you could create an identity, in which case in the Actions portlet you can say Add Organization Identity, and actually add an identity into the Policy Manager's local database, or select the Manage Organization Identities. You select identity you have created in the database. You can add identities from an external store identity system. Here to the Manage Identities and button, you can select from the train, which is our LDAP domain, or if you pull down in the within, you can select identities from the local system. Use the train, the domain. And I go ahead and select fiction, and it and an APP for app, and the search button. See that there's a bunch of app IDs in here. So the password. So just select one of these IDs. Don't select the top one because that is. Just go ahead and select one of the other ones where it says app and then some number, whichever one you want. Back one of them and move over to the right-hand side. Okay, so this is identifying application ID that is going to be authorized to invoke the service that you have included as part of your contract for services. And click on Apply. See here the application ID and organization. Okay, now go back to your engineering organization, did contracts, and look at that authorization contract. Down in the middle, when you look at consumer identities, able to see now added to your contract automatically. we have the QA organization selected. So make change the contract or have to change the contract for every single app ID that you add or every single service, you select the engineering or you select the top level organization and it will automatically get updated. The contract is in place. We have the services that are included as part of our contract, and I find that it's allowed to the services that are part of this contract. So the final thing that we have to do, I'm just up to slide one so I can size here. So the final thing that we have to do is we have to policies. So create a named contract. We need an operational policy that includes a method of authenticating. So we're going to use our username password policy. And we need an authentication policy with the domain selected and subject category set to consumer. Right? That's all that we need. We don't need any authorization rules and won't need an authorization policy because we're not doing any end user authorization. The named contract is actually what's doing the authorization for us. If I go back to the policy manager, let's look. So go to your engineering organization, open the services folder, account manager virtual service, click details subtab for that virtual service. Go to the policy attachments portlet for that virtual service. Now, this portlet, you should see the policy attached. Your uname over transport, your authentication policy, your authorization policy, and your detailed auditing policy. Named contract now, we don't need any authorization policy. Click on the Manage link, Operational Policies. You're just going to uncheck the policy. The next to do is we need to verify that our authentication policy is set to consumer. So the authentication policy, if you click on your authentication policy, select that and just click on that. When we were authenticating the users before, we were authenticating the end users. Right now we're authenticating the consumers. So selecting consumer here, we're telling the network director to look for consuming identity or organizational identities versus end user identities. Okay, so we modify this policy. So in the authentication policy portlet, right there you're going to click on the modify link and you switch the end user and click consumer. And just go ahead and click on apply. Finally, then we need to also make sure that the token that I'm sending in is also that I'm specifying a subject category that matches my authentication policy. If you click on your username over transport policy, two parts to it. This part 2 is a token type. see that where it's find the token type, its subject category is end user. Change this subcategory to also be consumer. Okay, so modify under where it says WS Security Supporting Tokens Policy. You're going to click on Modify. Just type the username token on the link at the bottom of the choice. Click on My Token. And the only you're going to change is you're going to change that subject category to consumer. And click on Next. Click on Keep the Defaults here. And you see the screen come back. Support token choice, username, and the subcategory should be consumer, not other. Verify that. Click on the Finish button at the bottom. You can close this window. Okay, now we have let's go back to our virtual service. Open Engineering Organization to the Services folder and click on your Account Manager Virtual Service. We only have 3 policies attached: username over transport, which we changed the subject category for the username to be consumer. Our authentication policy, we changed that to be a subject category of consumer, and we still have our detailed auditing policy attached. Go into SOAP UI and we're going to send a request. Now in SOAP UI, I continue to use the same user that I was using for the previous use case when I was doing end user authentication. Expect this then to also fail now. Okay, authorization failure. And this will be the same thing, that there's no contract to find. Go here to the monitoring data. User is not authorized to invoke the authorization. Because if my contract that I have in place for this particular service now, the contract that the only that are allowed to invoke my operation are app 3. So now if I change the user to app password to password you're using, and now to send the request, the request look now, I'm going to go back to the Policy Manager console, entering, because this is where you're going to be able to tell the difference between using a named versus anonymous contract. So look at the monitoring now. You can see that the contract that is being used for this particular request is in my usage data. The usage data. Now, instead of end user identity, it's showing me the consuming identity that is actually being used to invoke this service. Okay, so are there on that, and do you see the difference now between using name contract doing the end user authentication and authorization. Okay. If there's questions now, I think this will be a good time. We can break an hour for lunch, say till 10 after the hour, and we'll then work on creating, when we come back, we'll work on creating an SLA policy that we can attach to this contract that we have in place, and we'll actually set up SLA policies. Okay, so break lunch, and if everyone can ping me again when they're back, that would be great. Back at 10 after the hour to continue.